Hello, everyone, and thanks for listening to the Quality Hub, Chatting with ISO Experts. I'm your host, Xavier Francis, and today I'm here with Brian Smith, Director of Consulting Services, and Joe Hill, Consultant, both from here at Core. Glad you guys could both be with us.
Good to be here.
Good to be here as well.
Now, this week's podcast, we're going to be talking about ISO 9001, Clause 7.1.5, calibration in your QMS. Now, let's continue on with our discussion with Joe and Brian. So what factors should be considered when you're defining that frequency? Like you said before, you're protecting yourself and not wanting to spend an insane amount of money if something is found to be wrong. So how do you determine that?
It's based on risk.
Risks?
Yep. Yep. You got to determine the risk, and internal and external, financial and health and safety. All those things need to be factored in. Like I said, in most of the operations I've run, early on isn't as critical as late.
Right.
We would want to be frequent, late, because there's that big moment when it gets away from us and goes to the customer. As you get further in and you have more resources and overhead applied to that item, obviously, before it gets to the customer, you want to be very frequent. The frequency of calibrating the instrument, one, it could be manufacturer's recommendations.
Or requirement.
Yep. Statutory, regulatory, or customer requirements is in there. How small is the tolerance? So if you're measuring in 10,000ths, it's probably going to be more frequent than if your tolerance is in feet.
So if the feeler gauge is flexible, maybe maybe check it a little more often than the ones that actually could retain its rigidity, right?
The standard refers to it as the environment for the process. So if you have fluctuating temperatures, if it's a critical measurement, but it's in the middle of chaos, in a foundry, you want to make sure that calibration is more frequent. And like I said, it's risk. The newer version of the standard allows us to set up our system practically, but it's all driven by risk. It's not cut and dried. The standard doesn't tell us how frequent. They let it up to you so it can be practical and not be a hindrance. So you want to factor in the risk to the product, the customer, and your bottom line. And the higher the risk, the more frequent. How close is the measurement to the end of the process before we lose control of the product?
Gotcha.
That one, I've seen machine shops that calibrate that micrometer daily. Officially in the shop, in the lab, they do that daily. Again, we go back to the eggs. You would want that stuff calibrated very, very frequently, because if it gets away from us, it's going to make people sick. The acceptance tolerance. Acceptance tolerance is critical on the frequency. It depends what you're working with.
Right.
If it's titanium parts for airplanes, it's going to be frequent. If it's a wooden block for the bottom of your chair, on the other hand, right? Yeah. Environmental conditions kind of plays into it. And environmental conditions, I'm not talking about bugs and birds. I'm talking about the environment for the process. So if it's in a changing environment or a rough environment, like it could cause damage. You read the standard where it said protected from adjustment and damage. If there's a high probability of getting dropped or run into or stepped on or something, you'd want to up the frequency. And just a note on that environmental conditions, you want to calibrate these things in the same environmental condition they're used in. You don't want to calibrate your micrometer in a 72-degree lab and then go out like today when it's 4. You're probably going to have a problem.
Well, and same thing going with the eggs, when you speak about environment. If you're trying to keep eggs warm on a day like today, that's an environmental concern.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, I think we mentioned compliance obligations. Again, when you're working with engineered parts or, things like that, a lot of times your customer will tell you how frequently they want record of what instrument you used, how frequently it was calibrated, and they'll tell you how to do that. I mean, that makes it easy on you, but
no, that's good.
Oh, severity ramifications of the failed measurement. So the frequency of calibration when the ramifications are severe of something being out of calibration. And I think we talked about that with the egg, with something that could make people sick, medicine, things like that. I mean, that gets a little bit deep, but.
Or like you said, the cost, like if it's out of titanium.
Right.
Oh, great. We got to replace all that. That's not cheap. Yeah.
Yeah. And ramifications, again, we get back, there's many kinds of risk. I was involved in a calibration process that was failing at one of my customers. They had a blanket frequency across the board, but some of the parts that they were measuring cost $140 a piece. Some of them cost 1.4 cents a piece. And it was a blanket policy.
Wow.
Right? So they lost 2 of those 1.4 cents ones over the last 10 years. We're going to go ahead and just accept that risk. And we're going to do 100% on the ones that cost $140. Set your calibration frequencies up the same. If I have a $10,000 item, I'm calibrating that thing every time we use it. If I got a 10-cent item and we're not going to lose any sleep over it, then put it on a quarterly or biannual frequency.
Gotcha. So, Joe, how does an organization verify the adequacy of subcontracted calibration services?
Sure. Lots of organizations will choose to use external providers to conduct their calibrations of their equipment. So you want to ensure that that provider is actually accredited and certified to provide those activities.
Mm-hmm.
There are specific ISO standards designated for calibration houses, such as ISO 17025. So you want to ensure that the calibration provider is accredited under one of these standards.
Okay.
The external provider's certification will generally also identify the types of tools and or equipment under which the provider is accredited.
Mm-hmm.
So you also want to verify that the provider is certified and accredited to calibrate the specific tools and or equipment that you are having them calibrate.
Gotcha. That's definitely important, I would think.
One would imagine, yes.
Okay. So what are the implications of using equipment if it's not been calibrated or it's overdue for calibration?
So obviously we talked about risk, but your risk just went way up.
Mm-hmm.
And you spent time determining the risk factor in these frequencies, and now you're over that. So you're rolling the dice.
Right.
So, if something gets out of the factory that's out of tolerance, a product, you're looking at expensive recalls.
Yep.
You're looking at customer satisfaction issues, embarrassment, things like that. Internally, you're looking at internal cost of quality.
Mm-hmm.
So if something gets missed early and gets through 5 more steps of the process and found to be out of tolerance, and all 5 of those were wasted.
Right.
And the raw material. So that's the beautiful thing about setting up your own frequencies. Set them up practically and according to the risk you're willing to take. Or on the other hand, like we said, if it's an obligation, if the customer or regulatory, well, then you could be in trouble. Customer comes in for a surprised audit, or even not a surprised audit, and finds something, that could be a lot of trouble. That's a breach of contract.
Right. Now, what happens if it's overdue? It's overdue. You calibrate it. Everything's fine. Or you test it and calibrate. It's still in calibration.
Say it is 2 weeks overdue. You catch it and go through your calibration process, and it's fine. There's really nothing to do.
Right.
Except for find out how it got overdue.
Right.
And eliminate the root cause of that.
Right.
Right. If you need more resources, if you need some kind of software that reminds you,
like Core,
or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the only action that needs taken is like, how'd that happen?
Now, if it's found to be out, now we're talking about all the things you said before.
Now we got problems.
Well, like you said, there could be a ton of waste, ton of energy, time, potential material, and loss of reputation and money if you have to recall something. Joe, how can an organization mitigate risks associated with improperly calibrated equipment? I know Brian mentioned it a little bit. You talk about the risks.
Sure. A lot of the organizations I work with will implement verification activities in between the formal calibrations of the tools and equipment. You could have your employees check the tools prior to use, such as checking a set of calipers against a calibrated gauge block set before you actually do the measurement.
Right.
You also want to make sure that, as we mentioned before, that a calibration frequency is appropriate for the tool and the risk and what it is used for. Depending on that criticality, you may want or need to have a more frequent calibration frequency. Also, something to consider, a lot of the organizations will allow their employees to bring in their own tools to be used. otherwise known as employee-owned gauges or employee-owned tools. So it's important that you recognize those tools as well under your overall calibration program, because if you're allowing them to bring in their own tools from home,
you got to make sure
still got to make sure that they're providing accurate results.
Absolutely. So. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a couple. Most machine shops, precision machine shops, your operators do have a block, a gauge block, and every time they do a setup, they verify their micrometer before they do it. You still want someone who's trained and your designated calibration individual on your designated traceable blocks to do a calibration on that at planned intervals. But most machine operators will verify their stuff almost every time they use it. Same way with stuff guys bring in. If you're bringing in your own tools, you still got to account for them, right? You want to put them in your system. And that can add some difficulty because replacement of tools and things like that, it has to be under control. And if they're the ones buying it, it can get away from you. You got to be really careful with that.
Well, yeah. And are they using them outside of work?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Sometimes you do see it. I mean, there's a lot of shops where it's a big toolbox, and when you come to work, you're expected to have your own stuff.
Yeah.
All that has to be accounted for.
Well, this has been great. Very insightful. Do you guys have any last thoughts?
We talked a lot about calibration, but in the standard, it says verification. We talked a little bit about that. Don't be afraid to verify fixtures, jigs, work surfaces, rulers, tape measures. Don't ever pay anybody to calibrate a tape measure. If it's that critical of a measurement, use something besides a tape measure.
Okay.
But there's nothing wrong with having a tape measure brought into the calibration lab periodically to make sure that they're not, they didn't smash that end of it down because it was loose.
Yeah.
But for me, I had 300 fixtures, jigs and fixtures, and I had them serial numbered, and I had somebody go through them according to use. Some of them got used all the time. We checked those, and we actually ran it like a calibration system, but you couldn't call it calibration. But we wanted to make sure that those were in good working condition.
So verifying is definitely different than certifying. You're verifying is you check and making sure it's good. And then certification is it's been tested.
Calibration has been formally either adjusted or corrected or
calibration is sanctioned. Verification is you're doing it on your own.
Gotcha.
Don't just verify stuff that should be calibrated, and don't calibrate stuff that should be verified, because you're going to run yourself into the poorhouse.
Well, yeah. And the other thing is, like you were saying, the guys, okay, block says it's good, we're good. That's not the official person that is doing the certification.
Right. That's
the verification activity.
Right. Yeah. And what I was talking about is a little bit different. That wooden jig is never going to get calibrated, but you can use the same concepts. It's just never going to be to a standard, an NIST standard, and it's not going to a lab. Right. Usually your maintenance guys are one of your engineers or head operators you want to put in charge of that.
Gotcha. What do you got? You have to have something. He did.
It really depends on the tightness of your tolerances. But a lot of the digital micrometers or digital calipers, you could get a different result based on how hard you're actually pulling on that dial. So someone could verify it against a gauge block and get a result. Someone else doesn't pull the dial as hard, they'll get a slightly different result.
I think that goes to make sure you have the right quality of equipment. Yeah, I use those digital ones, but they also use them to pull staples out of the end of boards, right? Because an inmate can break a steel ball. If they're the ones that smash the end of the tape down because it was loose, because so you can butt it up against something.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's loose. Pound it down till it's tight. Yeah, I think the point.
It's loose for a reason.
Yeah. Yep. I've seen amazing things. I think the point Joe's making is make sure that the equipment that you're using for your measurement of your product is the right quality. An electronic caliper out of McMaster car that costs $40 is one thing.
Harbor Freight.
Or Harbor Freight. Yeah. If it's extremely critical, we bump it up to a micrometer, or you have that one caliper that is, a better one.
Right.
Because you can get varying readings from the cheaper stuff.
All right. Well, thank you guys for being here today. Really appreciate it. Hope to have you again soon. I'm sure we will.
This was fun. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
And we want to thank everyone who's listened to our podcast today. We hope it's been informative for you. Now, if you're looking for more information about Core Business Solutions and how we can help you with ISO certification, cybersecurity, customized training, maybe help you with calibrating and other things, please email us at info@thecoresolution.com. You can also visit our website at www.thecoresolution.com. And if you haven't already followed us on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube, be sure to do so. That way you won't miss the next Quality Hub podcast when it's released next week. Have a great day.